Hello, everybody. As we're waiting for more people to join, I can test my audio.
Howdy, I heard you.
Perfect.
Testing my side. I assume you see that, right?
Yes, we see the slides. We can hear you. We can see you.
Cool. Too late for coffee, Warren. It's bedtime.
Never too late for coffee. Actually, I mean, it's kind of early for coffee because I am now on Bangkok time for the rest of the week.
Each their own.
That's an espresso.
Good English breakfast.
All right, I think it is time. Mary, you want to get started? Yeah? Okay. So welcome to the Internet Architecture Board Open meeting, and we will go through a few slides and then we're going to switch places and Mary is going to talk. This is an IAB meeting, but we do cover it under the NoteWell. It is being held within the IETF, and we hold most of our meetings under NoteWell that everybody might participate in. Hopefully you all know it. Consult a lawyer, because I'm not one. So what is the IAB Open meeting? It is a IAB organized session trying to focus on sort of the things that we've been up to, the technical aspects and the architectural topics, trying to get more visibility into what the IAB is actually doing at the moment, as well as what we might do in the future, and then collect feedback and give community input about ongoing and new work. In particular, there's an open mic at the end. Feel free to contribute to the discussion at any point along the way. We have mailing lists that we use. The IAB has a wider architectural discussion where we hold conversations about the architecture of the internet in general, which is at architecturediscuss@iab.org. Anybody can sign up for it. And then IAB@iab.org is how you can reach the IAB in general, and you can mail that directly. And then we have program mailing lists that are specific to each of the different architectural programs that we manage, and we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes, actually, or Miriam will. So the agenda today, we're going to do the welcome and updates. We've just done a good percentage of that. Then we're going to talk about the COVID-19 Network Impacts workshop, and that was held last week, I think, if I have my timing right. We'll talk about the two technical programs that we have up and running, which are the EDM program and then the Model T. The first being Evolvability, Deployability, and Maintainability program, and Tommy will talk about that. And then the Internet Threat Model program, Stephen will talk about that. And then, of course, there'll be an open mic at the end where we hope to hear your comments. Mira, you're going to talk about restructuring the IAB programs.
Yeah, so one status update regarding programs. So the IAB has been talking for quite a while, actually, about how to better organize programs. And we've been very active on that and have some discussion about that lately. And at the end, we came up with a proposal where we figured out that we have actually two very different kind of things that we call programs currently, which somehow also need different management and different treatments. So the biggest change here really is that what we're proposing is that in future we want to have two different things. One is called technical programs, and the other one we call currently administrative support groups. There was already some name bashing about this on the mailing list, but the point was really also to not call a second thing program, to have a clear distinction. The whole point about this effort, or why this discussion started in the IAB at all, was really to be more open, to make programs, especially technical programs, more visible and increase transparency and have better exchange with the community. Before we go on the next slide, one note. So whatever we discuss here will not impact the RFC Future Editor Model program, and also not RSOC, because those are related. The Future Editor Model program is progressing well and will probably impact what RSOC is doing. So we definitely wait for that to conclude before we want to implement any changes or whatever. So there's no effect here, no plans from the IAB to interfere. If you can go on the next slide quickly. I give you some more details about what we mean by those two different things. So for technical programs, we see those as kind of, as the slide says here, short-lived. That doesn't mean we're talking about weeks or months. It's still about years, but it's still about probably longer than an IAB term might be. But the real point is that those programs are focused on a specific technical architecture issue or current problem. So the IAB goes ahead and identifies something that they want to discuss, that they want to move forward. They form a program. Usually the program has a task to kind of establish the discussion in the IETF or start some work in the IETF. It's not about solving the problem. It's more about creating awareness and having a discussion going, maybe giving recommendations. And then if this happens, if there is work going in the IETF or some discussion concluded in the IETF or whatever, that means the program has been successful and it can be closed again. And we also realized, which is like kind of different than programs worked initially, that this really needs a lot of exchange with the community. It needs both technical experts to give input, but the important part is the exchange with the community, awareness and openness. And so the other thing that we currently call programs are really more long-term activities, which means we have a program in it that will stay there kind of forever, except we decide we want to handle our responsibilities differently. And those groups really support the IAB in their chartered responsibilities. So that's very much in the sense of original programs as well, where we figured out we have some responsibilities where we need additional expertise because we don't have it in the IAB, or we definitely need long-term continuity. We want to have people who have history about this and who are involved in these topics for a longer time. And that's where we need administrative support groups. So if we talk about technical programs, that's currently Model T and the EDM program that we will hear later on. And when we talk about admin support groups, they are currently the plenary planning program, the IANA program, and the liaison program, or groups in future. And we're also reviewing these. So this slide is really to provide awareness. We've sent out a call for feedback on the architecture discuss list. We discussed this for a while internally. We also try to clarify the kind of procedures we want to use to manage these things, also to provide more transparency in the community, and to also maintain expectations and knowledge about what these things are and how they're supposed to work. So there's a long document on GitHub that you can look at and read and comment on and provide feedback, because maybe we didn't consider everything. We can also take quick questions if you have something that needs clarification, but I think like the main discussion should go on the architecture discuss list, or provide direct feedback to the IAB, or provide or open issues at GitHub if you have very concrete proposals. Yeah, anybody who has a quick question on that, Spencer is there. Somehow, Spencer, you were there for a minute, but we couldn't hear you. Do you want to try again to unmute yourself?
Audio now? Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
It seems to take about 3 tries for me. I'm not sure why. I had two things that I said on the mailing list that I just wanted to get maybe a little bit more visibility for. One is that calling these things administrative support groups. Usually administration means something else in the IETF, and it seemed like to me that these were all oversight support groups. So I was suggesting that change, just a change of term there. The other thing was, and this is not on your slide, but I thought that one of the things with the technical programs was that they were more headed towards open membership, where the oversight support groups really, a lot of those things, at least at some times, have needed to have closed membership. So just when you're explaining this to people, maybe including that, if that's true, maybe including that in the description. Thank you.
Thanks. We will cut the queue at this point already. Just to reply to your point, so we definitely want to be very transparent about both, but it's true there's a point about confidentiality that is important for these administrative support groups as well. Yes. Dave.
Understand right, you're saying that there are no long-lived technical programs because it looks like now the IAB is deciding that there is no such thing as a long-lived technical or architectural issues. Is that correct? When the notion of programs was first created in the IAB, the program was sort of by definition only the long-lived things, and the short-lived things the IAB did not create a program for. It just had people doing it and never called it a program. And of course, the IAB can reorganize itself whenever it wants to do whatever it wants. This is perfectly fine, right? Because you're empowered to do this. My question is there any long-lived technical architectural issue?
So I'm going to take the blame for that one, because Stephen rightly pointed out that we should have put frequently short-lived on the slides, and I failed to update the slides by the time, because it was like, in the last 12 hours or something like that. So I think that the answer is, and I would think that, trying not to speak for everybody, this is a framework. It is not, hard and fast rules. This is sort of how we see, breaking things up to make them more understandable to the general public, as well as is more manageable by us. So, things may not fit exactly in these lines, and at least I'm fine with that, and I suspect everybody else is too.
Okay,
So, but there's also
typically short-lived, and I think this is fine. Thank you.
Yeah, but there's also a point that technical programs should really be focused on a specific problem. And so ideally you succeed with the problem if the problem is addressed in the IETF, right? If it's kind of an unaddressable program, maybe you also want to give up at some point, I don't know, or you keep it open forever. But what we've seen in the past is actually that the SecPref program, the StackEagle program, whatever, they actually have concluded successfully. They reached a point of time where they thought there's nothing to do for the IAB anymore because work is ongoing in the IETF, or there's nothing we can resolve. But there is flexibility. Okay, Matthew. Matthew, you have to unmute yourself.
Matthew, you should be able to click the microphone button that's sort of in the top left to unmute yourself if you still want to say something. Maybe he's disappeared.
Okay, we can take this to the open mic if there are further questions.
Yeah, so I know we're short on time today, so do expect to come back during open mic if there's more questions about this. In the meantime, I think we'll switch to, yeah, looks like Matthew went away. In the meantime, let's switch to Yari and the COVID-19 Network Impacts Workshop. Yari, I hope you're here somewhere. And do you want to present your slides, or do you want me to?
It would be preferable if you can do it. I haven't tested it actually, and I actually uploaded also new ones like 3 minutes ago. And okay. Amazingly, you may not have. But it doesn't really matter. We can, if you can easily get to that, then that'd be
actually great. I think I do have them in. So, one sec. Perfect. Once you start talking, and I'll get them.
Yeah. So this is about the workshop that the IAB held actually last week. We announced it in actually the previous IAB Open meeting in July, and had a session paper deadline early October. And just held the workshop, and I see that the screen share is being started. Let's see if we get it.
Oh, now it's giving me an error. Nice.
Yeah. Anyway, so we did receive about 20 position paper submissions. And many of them actually with very, very interesting measurement results, and very thankful that people from both academia and industry were able to provide information for us. I should also note that, of course, this is not the only place where data from this year is being published. The IMC conference, for instance, had lots of interesting things. A lot of the authors that submitted material to us also submitted papers there. The papers are available at the link that you can see on the screen. And the recordings and notes will be available soon. Actually, the recordings are already available. I just don't have the link here, but I can post the YouTube links to the chamber room in a moment. And go to the next slide. So we had lots of discussion in the workshop. We met on 3 separate days and thought about like what did we see, and what worked well and why, and what did not work well, and so forth. And let's just go through briefly some of the thoughts that were expressed in the workshop. I think the overall feeling was that the internet did pretty well. We had a reasonably good situation, not perfect, some slowdowns, and all of us probably experienced some kind of this meeting thing doesn't work right now event quite often, but it was a reasonably good situation, nothing particularly alarming, at least according to the statistics that we've been able to see. And of course, the internet actually helped a huge amount of people in the world this year to continue their work or be in contact with their family and so forth. We also have indeed very interesting data about the situation from many directions. So that's great. And I think that when you actually talk to people that run operator networks or were running services, what comes across is that everybody was very highly motivated to ensure a good experience. So people were calling each other, making sure that, hey, we're seeing this problem over there in your network, can we do something about that, and so on. So a lot of things happened actually in the background that may not be so visible in the public eye, but that was the feeling that when you talk to people that you get. And I guess we also felt that the internet is fairly well suited for adapting to new situations for various reasons, like, just to mention one thing, that when most of our services run in the cloud, you can relatively easily reconfigure that to do other services. There's a huge shift in the type of services that people were using. Obviously, e-learning, e-working, and so on was very popular. Travel applications, not so much, for instance. So all this is great. If you click one more time, go to the next slide. Thank you. But of course, there's also some issues. So one is that we actually have somewhat limited ability to observe like what's actually going on. We have also limited ability to control things, like even if I as a user would like to do something for my traffic, I can't necessarily always make that happen. We may not always be able to collaborate among parties whose collaboration would be beneficial, but there's just no way, technically or business-wise. We should also remember that we had one situation. Like, what if we had, something else, like a catastrophe or natural catastrophe somewhere that would take some networks down and so on? How would we have fared in that case? So it's worthwhile to think about the different kinds of scenarios that we could have been in. And of course, the internet has been hugely important for us, particularly this year. Like, we just can't do our work, we can't do our e-health, we can't do much without the internet. So that has kind of also amplified the digital divide. So if you were not having a connectivity previously, maybe that was bad, but not super bad because you were still able to do your work. But now, if you don't have connectivity, well, you will not be working, and you will not be going to school and so on. So that's a thing. The other thing is that could we think about ways to make this better for some of the other situations that we could get into, and also we all of course know that there's tons of things to improve in the internet, from security and digital divide and all kinds of technical issues. So the fact that we fared reasonably well during the pandemic doesn't mean that we don't have these issues. We obviously need to work on those. Next slide, please. So some potential future things to address. Obviously, all the usual things that we actually have to do anyway. So everybody needs to make sure that they have, the reasonable capacity and ability to respond to situations different from, current day or this week. Make sure that our implementations are improving. Make sure that we run the right security practice and so forth. But more specifically, of course, we could have more measurements. Are the humans getting what they actually need? And because the human sort of need for internet actually increased this year, then it's also a question of whether we're actually matching that or not. Jana was at the workshop, and he talked about networks and applications collaborating, perhaps at an aggregate level instead of like detailed information about flows. So that's an interesting direction to think about. We should also think about resilience in different ways. What can we do to make sure the internet will not fall over because of some issue or incident? It was also discussed that centralization and consolidation is bad in this respect. We talked about DDoS defenses, and those should be part of the responses to emergencies or ability to do so. And of course, everything else we need to fix. Next slide, please. So this was the first time I think that the IAB has held a virtual workshop, or like a proper workshop, but not meeting physically. And I guess the general feeling was that this seemed to work well. We had a healthy amount of discussion. We had about 30 to 40 people at different times in the workshop, and it seemed to be the right amount of people, and very, very good discussion. We did split the agenda into 3 days or sessions with a free day in between. And this many people found useful because you actually had some time to think about stuff. If we had like an actual physical workshop, we would have packed it in a day and a half, and it would have been a coffee break and immediately to the next thing. So that was a really good thing. We did have some practical issues, and we did have difficulties in separating sometimes the COVID-19 aspect of things and everything else about the internet, because as we know, there's things to do. But that's roughly the report. I don't know if anybody else, Mirja or others who were at the workshop, wants to add anything. Stephen?
Yeah, I can only agree that actually it was a quite good experience. Of course, social interactions in the coffee breaks and so on help as well. But hopefully we will get back to that at some point. We have a queue. Elliot is in the queue.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends. Yadi, I have one question that I hope you can delve into in the report. Who is this we? If you go back to your slide 2, I think it is, and throughout your presentation, you talk about we have limited information. We have, I'm sorry, it was slide 3, my apologies. Who doesn't have, who has the information and who doesn't? And under what circumstances should that information be shared? And how should it be collated? And with what authorization? I think these are key questions, because I think we have a lot of information depending on who we is. Thanks very much.
Yeah, it's a really good question. We'll deal with that in the report. Just to make a quick observation that we, in this case, and it was sloppily written in the slides, but we can be a number of things. Like I mean, just from a personal perspective, like I don't have enough information. Like, why on earth isn't my conference call working well today? Is it the Wi-Fi or the ISP or something else? And the same is true of the other end. Like if you're the conference provider, can actually get enough information? But also in a more broader sense, like the society would actually benefit from having an understanding of how well is the internet doing in our country. Are the services running? Do we get the bang out of the internet that we actually expect or need? It's a good question. Lots to think about.
Yeah, and it was discussed at the workshop, because at least for me, it was very nice to see all these measurements together from different angles. So there was a lot of discussion about how to better share information or provide information. We have Torles.
Oh yeah, so thanks for this. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend last week, but it would certainly be good to see if there can be a little bit more ongoing, considerations about this, not, limited only to COVID, right? Because I think we've seen over the decades a lot of, questions about reliability of critical services. And I think that limiting this to just, quote, the internet or so, which is what we see at home, which obviously is now with COVID a big thing, is not very inclusive, because the bigger issues seem to be with a lot of the controlled networks that may be using parts of the same infrastructure. But so, for example, we've seen in any type of catastrophes, a lot of the critical, providers of services in that instance to break down, which may or may not impact part of the internet, or when we basically see something that impacts the 9/11 service, we're seeing, very nice analyses of network problems from the FCC. I'm not sure how much of that exists in other countries, right? So would be great to figure out if this could be, become part of a, longer process for IAB and the community here.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Of course, not just the IETF and IAB, but lots of other players. So, but I do agree that we do need focus on this in the world in some fashion.
Okay, I would like to cut the queue, and we can come back to this in the open mic if needed. And we have Michael.
Hi, Gary. Thanks. I was hoping to attend as well last week, but I didn't. You said that one of the things that happened is there was a lot of conversations among operators, I guess, about fixing this and fixing that. And I don't expect you have that information, but I think that the public kind of needs to know some of the nature of that. And you were just speaking in answer to Elliot as well about who's the we and all this kind of stuff, and are we getting the internet we deserve? And I think it is really really important that someone write, even if it's semi-fictionalized, some kind of a story about some of those things that happened, and some of the repairs and things that went out, because I think the public really kind of needs to know
that the protocols we're designing are evolvable and going to work in deployments and over time, both in how they're designed and how we are kind of evaluating them and testing them during the protocol development process. And the two topics that we've discussed so far most are one on the evolvability side, how we handle protocol extensions and ossification, and then on more of the kind of practical deployability side, as we're getting protocols ready, discussing how are we tracking implementation, testing, and interoperability in our working groups, and trying to understand, kind of what our strategy there ends up leading to in the actual deployed internet later after we've kind of finished the work in the IETF. So next slide, please. So on the extensibility side of things, the main item that we're planning on doing is discussing and kind of moving forward a draft that Martin Thompson had written previously a couple years ago, which is called Use It or Lose It, which is the formal name is Long-Term Viability of Protocol Extension Mechanisms. And a lot of this is trying to formalize in an IAB document some of the notions around greasing and active use, and how do we ensure that our protocols aren't as vulnerable to ossification as we've seen for a lot of protocols in the past. And it has a lot of good discussion around different examples of protocols that have succeeded or failed, and the strategies that we are seeing come out to successfully avoid protocols ossifying to the point that you cannot actually use some of the extension points you designed in the protocol. The main things it focuses on are active use, which is, you just want to use the protocol extension mechanisms that you have. That's the best way to ensure that you will be able to use them going forward. Talks about how you can encrypt that to make sure that fewer people can ossify. It discusses greasing mechanisms, and also talks about invariance. So this is going to be one of the main topics we have for our December meeting. And particularly, we've had some conversations on the list and on GitHub about greasing specifically. Greasing is a technique that we've seen come from TLS, and we're talking about it for other protocols, but generally it's been applied to protocols that have already had ossification problems and we're trying to rectify things. I think that's an interesting conversation that we're having about, as we're designing new protocols or new protocol versions, what does it mean to put something like greasing or build more active use into the protocol design itself rather than tacking it on later? So that's going to be an interesting discussion, and if you want to participate in that, please join the list, and you'll get the coordinates for that meeting. Next slide, please. And then just very quickly a note on the other side of things, we're talking about how do we track our interoperability and deployments as we're developing them. A couple of us did an experiment during this hackathon in which we are trying to build some generic tools that hopefully other hackathon teams or also other people doing protocol development in general in IETF could use to have some more automated tools for tracking results and reporting results of testing against documents. So in this case, we defined some tags that we could add to markdown files for drafts that would essentially annotate, here are some of the requirements that we think need to be tested or validated as you're building a implementation, specifically that ensure that you are interoperable, but also that maybe you're following some of the requirements we have around extensibility. And then this generates a file that actual implementations, as they're doing testing, can essentially just upload a JSON to say whether or not they pass that given test. So next slide. I shamelessly based this on something that Mark Nottingham had made for some HTTP cache testing across different browsers, but we are working on making this into a generic template that anyone could drop into any repository they have for their documents. This is on GitHub here that's being hosted, and you can just have columns that are automatically generated for any implementations that are being created against these specs. Next slide. And this is the last thing. So right now for these couple documents that we have testing, we added links from the actual documents into that interop status. This is something maybe that we could see going forward for working groups and other documents to do, such that people who are coming to work on these protocols, or even as the working groups themselves are evaluating the status of the document being ready to move on, can see what exactly has been done, what's been tested, which points have actually been exercised in the protocol by active implementations. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Tommy. We have Stuart in the queue.
Forgive me, Tommy, but I jumped back in the queue because I got kicked out with the glitch that happened. I just wanted to comment on what Jari Akko said and agree with that. And I expect you will agree too. I think it would be really, really good if the IETF could work on defining network quality. Users all over the world today, they go to speedtest.net and they measure the megabits up and the megabits down, and they think that tells them whether Meet Echo is going to work for them. And I think it would be really valuable if we could start some discussions about what constitutes network quality. Does an ISP support IPv6? Do they use ECN and smart queuing to minimize buffer bloat? Do they block DNS queries for anything other than v4 and v6 addresses? Because that impacts the HTTP SVC DNS query. Do they block TCP fast open? Do they block multipath TCP? There are many, many aspects of network performance and reliability and quality that go far beyond how many megabits download speed can you get. So I would love to see the IETF do some work in that area.
I mean, I think we have a bunch of documents recommending whatever AQM, use of ECN and so on, but maybe there's a good point in trying to actually bundle this all together and say more. It's an interesting
I think the documents are there. I think collecting them and deciding which are important. And I think what I'm really talking about is, and this is maybe more of an open source thing than an IETF thing, but if we could build some tool that people can run that gives them a dashboard about what kind of service they're getting and what's broken and what's working, that would be useful to end users in a way that RFCs don't directly answer that question.
And Tommy is the IPPM chair, so work in that group as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Any questions for Tommy? Any quick questions for Tommy? Okay, we don't have anybody in the queue, so people can join the program mailing list if they want to contribute and be involved in discussion. We have Steven.
Hey, so yeah, the Model T program, I very little to say and won't use much time. So the program basically exists to try and discuss the internet threat model and changes to that, and possibly to offer some updated text back to the IETF that could be considered by SAG or by the security ADs as a possible BCP. There's not much has happened in the last while. We did have a chat back in August. There hasn't been a huge amount of follow-up for that. Probably, I think it's mostly down to the 2020isms. People are busy elsewhere, and it's hard to concentrate on everything, I guess. The list is there. It's an open program. And there's a bunch of drafts people have written. So next slide. So there's a whole pile of drafts, as you can see. none of them are particularly finished. I guess that there's kind of reasonable text amongst a whole bunch of them that we need to kind of get through and see which bits are worth kind of trying to preserve in RSC like format, or try and offer back to the IETF as a possible VCP. And yeah, if you're interested in the kind of internet threat model and how that's evolving, then jump on the list and get involved. And we'll probably try and organize a chat either before or after the holidays to see if we can get things moving again. That's all I had. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, thank you. Nobody in the queue right now. But with that, we can probably start the open mic anyway. Okay, yeah. Wes is putting up a slide. That's what I'm waiting for. Yeah, so just quickly, we have 10 minutes to go. That's good. So this open mic really is about architectural and technical topics. We also have the open mic tomorrow in the plenary session, which is like more on maybe administrative questions or whatever. But like this open mic specifically, we want to get feedback on the IAB Open session as well as a whole. You can provide feedback on the talks we have or other architecture and technical topics. And with that, we start with Mark.
Okay, thanks. And really quickly, I'm supportive of the work that the IAB is doing in terms of rethinking how it does the program and administrative work. But one of the things I really want to encourage the IAB to think about is how at the end of these programs, when you get to the end of a program, and one of the ones I'm involved in is Model T, how you get an actionable result, right? How we actually move forward from the results of an IAB program into constructive work that takes place in the IRTF or the IETF. And the document that's on GitHub is very, very explicit about what the programs don't do. But what I hope you reconsider or think about is what the end of those programs provide as actionable material for other parts of the organization. Thanks.
I'd even like to take it up a level higher too, because I mean, I think that that's an issue across the entire industry, from academia into IRTF into IETF into tech transfer into industry has always been a long-term issue within the IETF. And you're absolutely right that IAB programs are going to suffer the exact same problem unless we figure out how to adequately transition stuff. And I've spoken to a lot of people about that. And if you have ideas on making that work really well, certainly bring them up on Architecture Discuss.
Yeah, I also wanted to comment, but that, as you said right now, I think the main purpose of the IB program is really to transition or start discussions, start working the IETF, and that's not always well defined. So we did have problems in the past to actually figure out when a program ended, when we achieved enough, which is also why we've been reconsidering this to make sure we have a kind of quicker feedback loop and figuring out where we are in the programs. But it's not like, it's really hard to define this with a sharp point milestone or whatever, and that's not necessarily what we want, but definitely something to consider.
Anybody else have questions? Sorry.
It can't be that we've been lacking behind time and now we end early. There's Brian.
Hello, I just want to save you from like 7 minutes of awkward silence. So I wanted to go back to something from the IAB COVID workshop, which I attended, which was actually quite an awesome experience. Well done again for the organizers of that. There was some discussion at the end of that that I would encourage the IAB to think about like sort of the very end of the last day. It's like, hey, the internet worked well, but the internet worked well for things that the internet works well for, right? Like, so as a network, it has, based on its architecture, certain affordances, right? And, one of those affordances is it moves bandwidth to endpoints really quickly, because that's what we designed it to do. And like sort of anecdotes from that are like people saying that the limiting factor that this network has had in terms of moving everybody online has not been the bandwidth in most markets, right? And when it was the bandwidth in those markets, it ended up not being the bandwidth because we could, add bandwidth relatively quickly. The limiting factor has been, in a lot of cases, room, right? Like, so if you've got a family of 5 and they're all expected to be online at the same time, a lot of houses don't have 5 doors you can close to keep the ambient noise down, right? Or another one I've heard is devices, right? Like, so you have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, they don't all need their own tablets, but now they do because they both have to be in remote schooling at the same time. From the internet standpoint, we would say that this was a success, right? Because we were able to deliver the bandwidth and the connectivity to the point that the internet was not the critical path for this experience that people have had. I'm not sure how to turn this into a thing that the IAB should consider that isn't like sort of a rabbit hole, and maybe it turns into something kind of like the discussion that we tried to have about consolidation, where we'd run it off into the economic corners and then say, oop, not our area. But I think considering not just the affordances of the network and the network architecture, but of the application architecture that's been built on top of it in the last 10 to 15 years, so the web and the services that sit on top of the web, it would be interesting to sort of like sit back and reflect on, what success is for taking everything remote, and what success is for, beyond just the sort of the pushing packets part of it. It's kind of an inchoate thought, which is why I waited for there to be 7 minutes of awkward silence to bring it up. But I would suggest that the IAB sort of like think about that in possibly a follow-on workshop to the COVID impacts workshop.
We have Yari.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. That was a really good comment, and it is true that this is much broader than the sort of narrow technical thing that we like to think of, and your examples aren't the only ones. Like, we didn't have much congestion. In fact, we didn't have any congestion from those people who were not connected to the internet. So there's lots of things that one should think about, and for the sort of social impact of ICT technologies or the internet to what the rest of us do. So I don't know exactly how to go about that, but it's good to keep that in mind, that it's not all the packet moving part of this is not the whole picture.
Thanks. We have Brian back in the queue. I'm not sure if you want to reply or if we should move on with the queue.
I have
Thanks,
like a 30-second thing that I would add to that. Yeah, so like you said, like there was no congestion from people who weren't connected to the internet. And the Internet Society, for example, has a wide variety of programs looking at improving connectivity for large parts of the world that were kind of left behind as part of this shift online. And possibly figuring out how to use the IAB in its capacity as a technical advisory committee to the Internet Society, and how the Internet Society could work on sort of problems other than basic connectivity, sort of like leveling up, might be worth your time.
So if I remember correctly, there is actually an initiative about measurements in the Internet Society, but I need to look that up to be sure. Let's move on with Michael.
Hi, thanks. I'll try to break this again. What Brian said about not having enough doors to close, and that was reminding me of the concept that people have devices and they don't always want to use the same devices, and the devices tend to be kind of single user-y in the sense that it's hard to actually get my settings onto the device in question. Just figuring out who has the Netflix password and how do I type it in and why do I have that in the first place. And so I think that there is a question here of identity and data, and how do I move that from device to device without having to do all this complexity. And so actually there's some place for standards that actually for bits that go over the wire in a somewhat secure way. And we see this in IoT as well, okay, that you need to get configurations on and off devices, and you need to replace them when they break and all sorts of stuff. And so actually I think there's a whole bunch of work there that is very end user focused, but is still bits in the wire, that stuff that we basically need to intelligently hide from them, so that it's done right rather than password 1 2 3 4.
I have a whole soapbox on that. I could go on for much longer than 2 minutes because I agree with you completely. I mean, it's insane that in order to send something from one phone to another phone, we basically leave the house network, and that has to do with identification more than anything else, and how to identify stuff. And we've made progress there with local DNS, MDNS type resolution and things like that to try and find stuff. But to the vast majority, the simpler solution for most people is send it out of the house and then back in. I've send a file to my wife using Dropbox, which is not true because I never use Dropbox, but a lot of people do that. It's a very valid point, Michael. I think it's interesting that there's a lot of comments in the last few questions about edge networks, right? We've concentrated for a long time on the core infrastructure and less on the edge. And I will note that the COIN IRTF group is you might be interested in looking at too, which is sort of dabbling around this space as well. For those that aren't familiar with it, that's the computing on the internet network. What's the I don't remember what it stands for, but it's edge network compute CPU thinking more than anything else.
So exactly, you reached, yeah.
Perfect.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess we're out of time and we're out of queue, so that worked out perfectly. Thank you everybody for coming, and we will see you again in March in the next virtual conference, because we've already decided that one's going to be virtual too.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Yep, do come to the plenary.
Thank you.
Make good choices, Spencer.